Mom won't know. This house should have been mine anyway. I heard my son's voice before I saw him, low and certain, carrying through the quiet walls of the lake house like it belonged there, like I no longer did, and I remember thinking, as I sat perfectly still in the dark with my hands folded in my lap, that there is a particular kind of silence that only comes when something sacred is about to be broken, and I had felt that silence building for weeks before that night ever arrived, long before the sound of metal against the lock, long before the door eased open with a slow, deliberate push, long before Brandon stepped inside the home his father had built for me 32 years ago, believing it was empty, believing I was somewhere else, believing whatever story he had chosen to tell himself, and I did not move when the door closed behind him. I did not call out his name. I did not even breathe any louder than I had been breathing before, because there is a difference between being caught off guard and choosing to wait. And that night, I was waiting. I had been waiting since the moment a message appeared on my phone 3 weeks earlier, a message not meant for me, a message sent in haste and deleted too late, but not before I saw it, not before I read the words that changed everything I thought I understood about my own family. Make sure your mother isn't at the lake house Friday night, Melissa had written. And I remember staring at the screen for a long time after that, my thumb hovering, my heart not racing the way it should have, just steady, just calm, because something inside me had already begun to shift, something that no longer needed to ask questions out loud. And from that moment on I started noticing the details I had once ignored, the way Brandon avoided looking directly at me when I mentioned the house, the way Melissa smiled a little too quickly whenever the topic of paperwork came up, the way small things began to move without explanation, a file out of place, a call from the bank asking me to confirm information I had never given, and I did not confront them. I did not ask for explanations because I have lived long enough to understand that people reveal far more when they believe you are not paying attention, and so I let them believe that. I let them think I was still the same woman who trusted too easily, who believed family meant safety, who assumed that love was enough to keep things from breaking, but love does not stop ambition. And it certainly does not stop someone from deciding what they think they deserve. And now here they were, standing in the house your father once told me would always be mine, stepping onto the hardwood floors he had laid with his own hands, speaking in voices that carried a kind of quiet entitlement, as if the story had already been written and all they were doing was walking into the final chapter. And I stayed where I was, seated in the dark, listening to my son move through the living room, hearing the soft shuffle of a second set of footsteps just behind him, lighter, more careful, Melissa following close, always just behind, always guiding without appearing to lead. And I thought about how strange it is that betrayal rarely announces itself in loud, obvious ways. It arrives softly, politely, dressed in concern and practicality, and by the time you recognize it, it has already made itself at home. And as I listened to them speak about this house, about what it should have been, about what they believed they had a right to take, I realized that this moment was not the beginning of anything. It was simply the point where everything hidden finally stepped into the light, even if they did not yet know that I was there to see it. I had not always been the kind of woman who sat in the dark and listened without speaking, but something in me had changed the morning that message appeared on my phone, and even now, as I listened to my son opening drawers that did not belong to him, I could still remember exactly where I was when I read it, standing at my kitchen counter with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hand, sunlight coming through the window just like any other morning, and for a moment I thought it had been sent to me by mistake without meaning anything at all, but the words stayed there, clear and deliberate, and there was something about the tone that made it impossible to ignore, something careful and planned, not emotional, not impulsive. And I have learned over the years that the most dangerous decisions are not the ones made in anger, they are the ones made quietly with time to think them through. And so I did not confront anyone that day. I did not call Brandon. I did not ask Melissa what she meant. Instead, I simply placed my phone face down on the counter and finished my coffee, because I needed to see how far they would go when they believed I was not watching. And over the following days I began to notice things that would have once slipped past me, small details that on their own meant very little, but together told a story I could no longer ignore. A call from the bank asking me to verify a request I had never made, a letter addressed to me that had already been opened before it reached my hands, a subtle shift in the way Brandon spoke to me, as if he had already decided something about my future without including me in the conversation. And Melissa, always composed, always polite, began asking questions that sounded like concern but felt like inventory. How often I visited the lake house, whether I still kept documents there, whether I had considered simplifying my living arrangements, And each time I answered calmly, giving nothing away, because the truth was I had already begun to understand what they were building toward, and once that understanding settled in, I realized that reacting too early would only warn them to change their approach, so instead I allowed the silence to stretch. I allowed them to believe their plan was unfolding exactly as intended, and during that time I made my own quiet decisions. I called Mr. Collins, the attorney who had handled my husband's affairs for years, and I asked him to review everything again, not because I doubted what had been put in place, but because I needed to be certain that nothing could be twisted or misunderstood. And when he sat across from me in his office and spread the documents out on his desk, he looked at me with a seriousness that told me he already suspected something was wrong. And when he showed me the copy of a document that had been submitted in my name granting limited authority over the lake house, I felt a stillness settle over me that was not shock, not exactly, but recognition, because the signature on that page was meant to look like mine, but it was not written the way I write it. There was an extra flourish in the middle initial, something I have never used, and I remember placing my finger on that line and saying quietly that I had never signed such a thing. And Mr. Collins nodded in a way that confirmed what I had already begun to accept, that someone had tried to move forward without my knowledge, believing they could make it appear legitimate after the fact. And even then I did not feel the urge to confront or accuse, because by that point I understood that this was no longer about a single action, it was about a pattern, a belief that I could be guided out of my own life with gentle pressure and careful timing. And so instead of reacting, I prepared. I drove out to the lake house earlier than usual, telling no one. I checked the locks. I made sure everything was exactly as it had always been, because I did not want to alert them that anything had changed. And then I waited, not out of fear but out of certainty, because when people believe they have accounted for every variable, they become careless, and I knew that if I gave them enough space, they would show me exactly who they had decided to become. And now, sitting there in the quiet, listening to the soft echo of footsteps moving deeper into the house, I understood that the waiting was over, and whatever came next would not be about assumptions anymore. It would be about truth finally stepping into the open. There was a time when that house did not belong to silence and suspicion, when every room carried a kind of warmth that made even the quiet feel alive. And as I sat there listening to Brandon move through the space as if he were already claiming it, I found myself remembering the first summer Harold brought me out here, long before the trees had grown tall enough to shade the windows, long before the dock had been extended, long before there was anything here except a stretch of open water and the promise of something we would build together. And I can still see him standing at the edge of the shoreline with his sleeves rolled up, pointing out where the deck would go, where the kitchen window would face the lake so I could watch the sunrise while making coffee. And he had smiled at me in that quiet way of his and said that this place was not just a house, it was a gift, something meant to hold the parts of life that the rest of the world could not reach. And over the years we filled it with small routines that became our own language: Saturday mornings with pancakes on the porch, evenings spent watching the light change over the water, conversations that did not need to be finished because we understood each other before the words were complete. And when he passed, that house did not feel empty the way our main home did. It felt steady, as if everything he had built into it remained, holding me up in ways I could not explain to anyone else. And that is why I never once thought of it as something to be divided or handed down early. It was not an asset waiting to be claimed. It was the last place where I still felt entirely myself, and yet somewhere along the way that meaning had been replaced by something else in Brandon's mind, something measured and calculated, something that reduced years of memory into square footage and market value. And I suppose I should not have been surprised, because I had watched the shift happen slowly after he married Melissa, not all at once, not in a way that could be easily pointed to, but in small changes that built on each other. The way he began to speak about the future in terms that did not include me, the way decisions were discussed as if they were already settled before I had even heard about them, the way Melissa would gently redirect conversations whenever I tried to share a memory, as if the past were something inconvenient rather than something worth preserving. And she was always careful, always respectful on the surface, but there was a pattern to it, a quiet reshaping of how things were viewed, until eventually even Brandon began to speak in the same tone, practical, detached, as though he were solving a problem rather than talking about his own mother. And sitting there in the dark, I could hear that tone now as clearly as I had heard it in my living room months ago, only this time there was no attempt to soften it, no effort to make it sound like concern, just the simple assumption that this place was theirs to step into. And I heard Melissa's voice behind him, low and controlled, pointing out details as if she were assessing something she already owned, the cabinets, the view, the condition of the floors, and there was something about the way she moved through the house that told me she had imagined this moment many times before, that she had walked through it in her mind, planning what would happen once I was no longer part of the equation. And I realized then that this was not just about taking something physical, it was about rewriting the story entirely, removing me from it in a way that made their version feel justified, and perhaps that is what unsettled me most, not the act itself, but the certainty behind it, the belief that I would not see, would not understand, would not resist, and yet as I remained there, still and silent, I felt none of the confusion they seemed to expect, only a quiet clarity, because I knew exactly what this house meant. I knew what had been promised within its walls, and I knew that whatever they believed they were entitled to, they had misunderstood something fundamental, something that could not be transferred or claimed simply by stepping inside. And as Brandon moved closer to the living room, his footsteps slowing slightly as if sensing that something was not quite as expected, I allowed myself a single breath, steady and measured, knowing that the moment where everything would have to be faced was drawing closer, and that when it arrived, there would be no need to raise my voice or defend myself, because the truth of this place, of everything it held, had never depended on whether they chose to acknowledge it. There is a particular moment when uncertainty gives way to understanding, and it does not arrive loudly, it settles in quietly, like a truth you have been circling for years finally choosing to sit beside you. And as I listened to Melissa moving through the kitchen, opening drawers with a familiarity that did not belong to her, I realized that none of this had begun with that message or the document at the lawyer's office. It had started much earlier, in conversations I had dismissed, in glances I had chosen not to interpret, in small adjustments to the rhythm of our family that I had once believed were simply part of change. And I could trace it back now with a clarity that felt almost surgical, the first time Melissa suggested that maintaining 2 properties was unnecessary at your age, the way she had said it with a gentle smile, as if she were offering practical advice rather than planting an idea, the time she asked if I had considered consolidating my assets to make things easier down the road, the emphasis on those last words subtle but deliberate, and Brandon standing beside her, nodding in quiet agreement, not looking at me the way he used to, not searching my face for reassurance, but instead waiting for my response as though I were a variable in a plan already being calculated. And I remember answering calmly, telling them that I was perfectly capable of managing my own affairs, and Melissa had tilted her head slightly, her expression soft but her eyes assessing, as if measuring how much resistance she would need to account for. And after that, the conversation shifted, no longer direct, no longer framed as suggestions but appearing in pieces woven into other topics, a mention of property taxes during dinner, a comment about how lakefront homes were appreciating in value, a question about whether I had updated my will recently, each one placed carefully, never enough on its own to demand confrontation, but together forming a pattern that only became visible when viewed from a distance, and I realized now that I had been watching that pattern form without fully acknowledging what it meant, perhaps because admitting it would have required me to accept something I was not ready to face, that my own son was no longer simply influenced by the person he married, but had begun to adopt her perspective as his own, and that shift, more than anything else, was what made this moment feel inevitable rather than surprising, because once someone begins to see the world through a lens of entitlement, everything that follows starts to align with that belief, and as I sat there, I could hear that belief in the way Brandon spoke now, not with hesitation or doubt, but with a quiet certainty that suggested he had already justified this to himself, already decided that whatever he was doing was reasonable, perhaps even necessary, and Melissa, always precise, responded in a tone that reinforced that certainty, pointing out where documents might be kept, suggesting what should be checked first, her voice steady and controlled, as if this were a task to be completed rather than a boundary being crossed, and I understood then that this was not a spontaneous decision. It was the result of weeks, perhaps months, of careful planning, conversations held behind closed doors, conclusions reached without my presence, and what unsettled me was not the planning itself, but the ease with which they moved through it, the absence of hesitation, the complete lack of awareness that anything about this required permission. And I thought about the way Melissa had once described herself as someone who believed in taking initiative, how she had laughed lightly when she said it, as if it were a harmless trait, but sitting there in the dark, listening to her guide my son through my own home, I understood what that initiative truly meant, it meant identifying what she wanted and finding a way to make it appear inevitable. It meant reshaping circumstances until resistance seemed unreasonable. And for a long time I had allowed that approach to exist at the edges of my life without challenging it, telling myself that it was easier to keep the peace, that small compromises were part of maintaining a relationship. But there comes a point when compromise stops being a choice and becomes an erasure, and I realized that. They had mistaken my patience for absence, my restraint for weakness, and now, as their footsteps moved closer, as the distance between what they believed and what was actually true narrowed with every second, I felt something settle within me, not anger, not even sadness, but a clarity that had been building quietly all along, because whatever they had convinced themselves this house represented, whatever story they had constructed to justify standing here tonight, it did not change the reality of what had been promised, what had been protected, and what still remained firmly within my control. And as the faint light from the hallway began to spill into the room where I sat, I knew that the moment for silence was coming to an end, and that when it did, the version of events they had prepared themselves for would no longer be the one they would have to face. There are moments when the truth no longer needs to be uncovered because it begins to reveal itself in the smallest of details. And as I listened to Melissa move with quiet precision through the room, I realized that what I had once mistaken for politeness had always carried a sharper edge beneath it, something deliberate and calculating that only became visible once I stopped giving it the benefit of doubt, and I could remember now the exact afternoon when that realization first took shape. Sitting across from her at my dining table while she traced the rim of her glass with her finger and spoke about long-term planning, in a tone so measured it almost sounded rehearsed, explaining how important it was for families to be proactive, to avoid confusion later on, to ensure that everything was already decided before it needed to be. And at the time I had nodded, offering small responses, because nothing she said was technically wrong, but there was something in the way she framed it. Something that positioned me not as the one making decisions, but as the subject of them, and Brandon had been there too, quieter than usual, watching her more than he watched me, as if waiting for cues rather than forming his own thoughts. And when she mentioned the lake house specifically, suggesting that it might be simpler if it were placed under joint management, I remember feeling a pause inside me, not alarm exactly, but a shift, the kind that tells you a line has been approached even if it has not yet been crossed, and I responded gently, telling her that nothing about my arrangements required simplification, that everything was already exactly as it needed to be. And she had smiled then, a small, controlled smile that did not quite reach her eyes, and she changed the subject with a smoothness that would have seemed natural if I had not already begun to notice the pattern. And after that day, the suggestions became less direct but more frequent, always appearing in different forms. A comment about how managing paperwork can become overwhelming, a casual remark about how many people their age struggle with property decisions, each one designed to plant the same idea without repeating it too obviously. And I realized that this was how she worked, not by forcing anything outright, but by reshaping the environment around it until it felt like the most reasonable conclusion. And perhaps that approach had worked in other areas of their lives. Perhaps it had even worked on Brandon because now, standing in the house that had never belonged to them, I could hear the confidence in his voice as he spoke about what needed to be done, what they should look for, what steps they would take next, as though all of this were simply a matter of following through on something already decided. And I wondered briefly if he had convinced himself that this was inevitable, that I would eventually step aside, that resistance would only be temporary. And it struck me then how easy it is for someone to rewrite reality when they surround themselves with the same narrative long enough, how repetition can turn assumption into certainty, and certainty into action. And as Melissa moved closer, her footsteps soft but purposeful, I could sense that she believed they had accounted for everything, that they had timed this moment carefully, chosen a night when they were certain I would not be here, chosen a plan that allowed them to enter without confrontation. And there was something almost clinical about the way she approached it, as if this were not personal at all, but simply an adjustment to circumstances. And that was perhaps the most revealing part, because for me this house was filled with memory, with years of quiet moments and shared promises, but for her it was a structure, a location, an opportunity, and in that difference lay the entire misunderstanding, because what they had come here to take could never be reduced to ownership alone. And yet they stood here believing that possession was something they could establish by presence, by paperwork, by timing, and I remained where I was, letting that belief unfold completely, because there is a certain clarity that only comes when people are allowed to reveal the full extent of what they intend, and as their voices grew slightly more confident, as the hesitation that might have existed at the threshold gave way to a sense of control, I felt that quiet certainty settle deeper within me, the understanding that whatever they had planned, whatever version of events they had prepared themselves for, it had not included the possibility that I would already be here, already aware, already steps ahead of everything they believed they were about to accomplish, and that realization more than anything else was what would change what happened next. I had learned long ago that preparation does not always look like action. Sometimes it looks like stillness, like choosing not to interrupt, like allowing events to unfold exactly as others have planned while quietly arranging what they have overlooked. And in the days leading up to this night, that was exactly what I had done, not with urgency or panic, but with a calm that surprised even me, because once the truth had settled in, once I understood that this was not a misunderstanding but a decision they had already made, everything became clearer, and clarity has a way of removing hesitation. So I went about my days as usual, answering calls, keeping conversations light, giving no indication that anything had shifted, because I knew that the moment they sensed resistance, they would adjust, they would delay, they would find another approach, and what I needed was not for them to change their plan, but to follow through with it exactly as they intended. And so I let the pattern continue. I let Melissa ask her careful questions. I let Brandon speak with that quiet confidence he had adopted, and in the meantime I made my own arrangements. I returned to the attorney's office and sat across from Mr. Collins once more, reviewing every document line by line, not because I doubted the structure that had been put in place, but because I needed to ensure that nothing could be misinterpreted or manipulated. And he listened as I explained what I had begun to suspect, his expression steady, his questions precise, and when I finished, he nodded in a way that confirmed he understood not just the legal implications but the personal ones as well, and together we made adjustments that were not dramatic, not obvious, but decisive clarifications that left no room for ambiguity, provisions that addressed situations I had once believed would never arise. And when I left his office that day, I felt a quiet sense of completion, not satisfaction exactly, but readiness, because whatever they believed they were preparing to do, they would not be stepping into uncertainty, they would be stepping into something that had already been accounted for. And after that, I drove out to the lake house earlier than usual, choosing a time when I knew they would not expect me, and I walked through each room slowly, not searching for anything in particular, but reacquainting myself with the space in a way that felt deliberate, as if I were marking it once again as mine. I checked the locks, I tested the windows, I made sure everything remained exactly as it had always been, because the last thing I wanted was to give them any indication that their assumptions might be wrong. And then I did something that would have seemed unnecessary to anyone else. I sat down in the living room and simply listened, letting the quiet settle around me, letting the hours pass without distraction, because I knew that waiting was not passive, it was part of the plan. And as the evening stretched into night, the house took on that familiar stillness, the kind that used to feel peaceful but now carried a different weight, not uncomfortable but expectant. And I thought about how often people assume that control comes from taking immediate action, from confronting, from demanding answers, but in my experience, control often comes from understanding timing, from knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, from allowing others to reveal themselves fully before stepping forward. And that was what this moment had become, not a confrontation but a revelation. And as I heard the first faint sound of the lock being tested, followed by the subtle shift of the door opening, I did not feel fear. I did not feel the need to react, because everything that was happening now had already been anticipated, every step they were taking had already been considered, and all that remained was for them to continue, to move forward with the certainty they had built for themselves, unaware that the outcome they expected had already been altered long before they arrived. And as their voices filled the space, confident and unguarded, I remained exactly where I had chosen to be, knowing that when the moment came to break the silence, it would not be out of impulse or emotion, but out of a quiet certainty that everything had unfolded exactly as it needed to. The sound of their voices grew steadier as they moved deeper into the house, no longer cautious, no longer pausing between steps as if expecting interruption, but instead settling into a rhythm that suggested they believed the space was already theirs. And I could hear Brandon setting something down on the kitchen counter, the faint thud of a bag followed by the rustle of paper, and Melissa's voice, low and composed, guiding him with the same quiet authority she had used in every conversation I had come to recognize over the past year, pointing out what to check first, reminding him of what they had discussed, and there was a strange familiarity in the way she spoke, as though she had rehearsed these words before, not necessarily in this exact room, but in moments leading up to it, in conversations held when they thought no one else would ever hear them, and I remained still, allowing each detail to settle into place, because it is in these unguarded moments that people reveal the clearest version of themselves. And Brandon, who once hesitated to make even small decisions without considering how they might affect others, now moved with a confidence that felt entirely borrowed, opening cabinets, stepping into rooms without knocking, his footsteps carrying an assumption that everything he touched would soon belong to him, and I wondered briefly if he felt any trace of the life that had been lived here, if he noticed the photographs still resting on the shelves, the small details that marked this place as something more than a property, but if he did, he gave no sign of it, and Melissa, always attentive to what mattered to her, directed his focus elsewhere, toward documents, toward drawers, toward anything that could be measured or claimed, and I could hear the quiet efficiency in the way they moved together, not hurried, not chaotic, but organized, as if they had already divided the tasks between them, and it struck me then how much planning must have gone into this, how many assumptions had been made, how many times they must have discussed what they believed would happen once they were inside. And yet for all that preparation, there was one detail they had never considered, one possibility they had never accounted for, and it was that absence of imagination that revealed the limits of their understanding, because they had planned for an empty house, for silence, for the ease of stepping into something unoccupied, but they had not planned for presence, for awareness, for the quiet certainty of someone who had already seen through every step they believed was hidden. And as Melissa moved closer to the living room, her voice lowering slightly as she spoke, I could sense a subtle shift in her tone, not hesitation exactly, but a narrowing of focus, as if she were beginning to notice that something was not aligning perfectly with what she had expected. Perhaps it was the way the air felt, or the arrangement of something small that she could not quite place, because even the most careful plans leave traces when they begin to unravel. And Brandon paused for a moment, his footsteps slowing, and I could hear him take a breath as if trying to orient himself, as if something in the space no longer matched the version he had constructed in his mind, and that was when I knew the moment had arrived, not because of anything dramatic, not because of a sudden realization, but because the certainty they had carried into this house had begun to thin, just enough to create a space where truth could enter, and I let the silence hold for one more second, just long enough for that uncertainty to settle fully, because there is a difference between interrupting someone and allowing them to reach the edge of their own assumptions, and when that edge is reached, there is nothing left to protect them from what comes next. And as the faint light from the hallway stretched across the floor and reached the chair where I sat, I placed my hands gently on the armrests and rose without haste, without sound beyond what was necessary, and I stepped forward just enough for my presence to be unmistakable, not announced, not forced, simply there, and in that quiet moment before any words were spoken, before any explanation could be offered, everything they believed about this night shifted completely, not because I had said anything, but because I had been there all along, waiting for them to arrive at a truth they never expected to face. Brandon froze first, not because he understood everything at once, but because something in him recognized that the version of events he had prepared for no longer existed, and Melissa, standing just behind him, went completely still in a way that told me she understood far more quickly than he did, her silence sharper, more deliberate, as if she were already calculating what this meant and how much of it could still be controlled, and for a moment none of us spoke, the air holding that fragile space between expectation and reality, and I could see it clearly in their faces even in the dim light, the shift from confidence to uncertainty, from assumption to awareness, and I did not rush to fill that silence because it was doing exactly what it needed to do. It was forcing them to confront what they had not planned for, and when Brandon finally spoke, his voice carried a strain that had not been there before, a hesitation that broke through the certainty he had brought with him, asking what I was doing there, as if my presence required explanation, and I looked at him steadily, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm that came from having already accepted what this moment represented, and I told him simply that I could ask the same question, because there are times when the most direct response is also the most revealing, and he faltered slightly, glancing toward Melissa as if searching for direction, and she stepped forward just enough to enter the light, her expression composed but tighter than before, and she spoke with that familiar tone, measured and reasonable, suggesting that there must be some misunderstanding, that they had only come to check on the property, that they were concerned about its condition, and I listened without interrupting, allowing her to complete the explanation she had already begun constructing, because I knew that every word she chose now would reveal the limits of her preparation, and when she finished, I nodded once, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, and then I stepped toward the table where they had placed their documents, the papers they had brought with them as if they would be enough to support whatever claim they intended to make, and I placed my hand gently on top of them, not taking them away, not pushing them aside, simply resting there as a quiet interruption, and I told them that I had already reviewed everything that needed to be reviewed, that I had already spoken to the people who needed to be consulted, and that whatever they believed they were here to establish had already been addressed before they arrived, and I could see the shift again, more pronounced this time, the realization beginning to settle in layers, not all at once, but enough to change the way they stood, the way they looked at each other, the way Brandon's confidence began to give way to something less certain, and Melissa, though still composed, no longer carried the same ease, her focus narrowing, her attention sharpening as she tried to assess how much I knew, how far ahead I might be, and I did not raise my voice, I did not list accusations or demand explanations, because none of that was necessary. The situation itself had already spoken more clearly than any argument could, and instead I reached into my bag and placed a single document on the table beside theirs, aligning it carefully, not dramatically, not forcefully, just enough to ensure that it could not be ignored, and I told them that this was the current and complete record of ownership and authority, reviewed and confirmed, with every detail clarified, every ambiguity removed, and I let that statement stand on its own, because sometimes clarity does more than confrontation ever could. And Brandon looked at the paper without immediately reaching for it, as if something in him already understood what it contained, and Melissa's expression tightened just slightly, a reaction so small it might have gone unnoticed if I had not been watching for it, and in that moment I realized that whatever plan they had built had depended entirely on the assumption that I would remain unaware, that I would not question, that I would not act, and now that assumption had been removed, leaving them with nothing to stand on except the reality in front of them, and I stepped back then, giving them the space to process it, because the truth does not need to be forced, it only needs to be present, and as the silence returned, heavier now but clearer, I understood that the outcome of this night had already been decided, not by what they had done, but by what they had failed to consider, and that everything they believed they were about to claim had already been placed firmly beyond their reach long before they ever stepped through that door. Brandon reached for the document slowly, as if the weight of it had already settled into his hands before he even touched the paper, and I watched the moment his eyes moved across the lines, the subtle change in his expression as understanding replaced whatever hope he had carried into the room, and it was not a dramatic reaction, not anger or disbelief, but something quieter, something heavier, the realization that the path he had chosen had led him somewhere he could not easily step back from. And Melissa, standing beside him, leaned slightly closer, her composure still intact but no longer effortless, her attention fixed on the same words, scanning for something she could challenge, something she could reinterpret, but there was nothing left open, nothing left uncertain, every detail had been made clear in a way that left no room for negotiation, and I remained where I was, giving them the time they needed to see it fully, because this was not a moment that required explanation, it required acknowledgement, and when Brandon finally looked up, his voice was lower than before, stripped of the confidence he had carried into the house, asking why I had not told him, and I considered that question for a moment, not because I did not have an answer, but because I wanted to be certain he understood it, and I told him that there had been nothing to tell, that everything had always been exactly as it was meant to be, and that what had changed was not the arrangement, but the assumptions he had chosen to make about it, and he looked at me then in a way that felt unfamiliar. Not with resentment, not even with confusion, but with something closer to recognition, as if he were seeing me clearly for the first time in a long while, and Melissa spoke again, her tone measured but more controlled now, suggesting that there must have been a miscommunication, that perhaps they had misunderstood certain details, and I let her finish, because I had no interest in interrupting a narrative that was already unraveling on its own, and then I told them calmly that misunderstanding requires uncertainty, and there had been none, that the decisions they had made were based on certainty, on the belief that they already knew how things would unfold, and that belief had led them here tonight, and the silence that followed was different from the ones before, not tense, not uncertain, but settled, as if the room itself had accepted the truth of what had been said. And I walked to the door then, not abruptly, not as a command, but as a quiet indication of what came next. And I opened it, letting the cool night air move through the space, carrying with it the stillness of the lake beyond. And I told them that this house had never been something waiting to be claimed, that it had been given, protected, and intended to remain exactly where it was, and that whatever they believed they were entitled to would have to be reconsidered in light of what they now understood. And Brandon stood there for a moment longer, as if trying to reconcile the person he thought he was with the actions that had brought him here. And then he nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acceptance, and Melissa, after a brief pause, gathered the papers they had brought, her movements precise but lacking the certainty they once held. And together they moved toward the door, not speaking, not arguing, because there was nothing left to argue, and as they stepped outside, I did not follow, I did not call after them, I simply closed the door once they had gone, the sound firm but not harsh, and I stood there for a moment in the quiet that returned, feeling the weight of what had just taken place settle into something that was not quite relief, not quite loss, but something in between, something steady. And I walked back into the living room and sat down in the same chair where I had been waiting, the house returning to its familiar stillness, the kind that no longer felt fragile, and I realized then that what had been taken from me was not this place, not the walls or the land or the view, but the illusion that things could remain unchanged simply because I wished them to, and in its place there was something clearer, something more honest, and as I looked out toward the dark surface of the lake, I understood that whatever remained of my life would no longer be shaped by what others expected to take, but by what I chose to keep. And for the first time in a long while, that choice felt entirely my own.